So this next chapter really talks about what we call population genetics. And then later in the semester, we'll talk about population ecology. But this would be population genetics. So we're going to look at how do populations change over time. And here in this picture is kind of an overview of what we're going to be doing in this section. Evolution occurs on allele frequencies, and they change. And so what you're going to see is changes in population due to natural selection, which we'll talk about, which we have already talked about, where certain types are selected against and those that are left breed. Something called genetic drift, which is actually changes due to random chance. And then gene flow, which is where we have individuals traveling from one place to another. So we'll look at all of these in detail over the next video or two. And so what we want to do really is, what is the smallest unit of evolution? And way back at the very beginning of this course, we gave you this list of, biosphere, ecosystems, and we want you to make sure you understand what the smallest unit of evolution actually is. What can it evolve? And so if you think about that for a minute, and often in class when we're in person, I would ask to see what your responses are. And a lot of times we get the individual or species level, and that's not really necessarily true. Individuals don't really evolve. Now, what you're thinking is, oh yes, I've changed. I'm so much better person than I was last week. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. But what I want you to get at as an individual, your DNA is pretty much set. Now we've got some of the things like CRISPR coming in, so maybe that changes. But for the most part, an individual doesn't change. You're not going to get taller, or you're not going to your phenotypes aren't going to change over your lifetime. Some things that are expressed might be expressed more or less, but you're not going to change. But populations can. And so that's what I want you to know. It's really the population level is where evolution really is happening. All right, so before we move on, let's talk about Rosemary and Peter Grant and give you an example of how this can happen. So these two researchers from, I believe it's Princeton, have been going to the Galapagos Islands for 6 months a year. And they've been studying on the Galapagos the Darwin's finches. And they've been doing this since, I believe, the 70s, 73, somewhere in there, till this present day. And what I want you to realize is they've been looking at these, and there was a drought. And this is actually one of the ground finches. And they were measuring the beak width, and that's actually what you can see them doing here. She's actually measuring the beak width, and Peter here is weighing the birds. They'll put them in a little bag so they can get a weight on them, and Rosemary is actually measuring the beak. And so that they've got the birds banded, and so they know a lot about these birds. And what they found is that after 2 years, the average beak depth actually changed almost, just under 2 millimeters. And so what I want you to realize is the individual didn't happen. The bird's beak didn't change. It's the same size. But what happened was the next generation of bird beaks were bigger. And it only took 2 years to get quite a bit bigger. And so what actually is happening is that with the drought, some of the plants are not seeding, and the ones that are actually dropping seeds are the ones with the larger seeds. So the finches that have the larger beaks are the ones that are able to use that food, and they're the ones that are surviving, and then they're having offspring, and because they are genetically have information for larger beaks, so do their kids. And so again, this is natural selection at its finest. This is really just looking at what Charles Darwin came up with. And there is all kinds of types of generic variation. There's genotypic variation that we've talked about before, where you have these introns and exons moving around, and so what gets actually read and what gets put out. And there's also phenotypic variation where there was a mutation, and you see in the horse color. So these variations do come into play as we look at the evolution of populations. And there are some variations that are not inheritable. And this is actually a caterpillar. And it's the same species. And it actually is, they look quite a bit different depending on what they're feeding on. And so this is they feed on oak trees. And this caterpillar here was fed as a youngster flowers from the oak tree. And so it kind of looks like a flower. And then this one was actually fed leaves from an oak tree, and it looks more like the stem of the oak. And so this is not inheritable. This is actually things within their environment and their diet that is causing them to look their way, the way they do. So anyway, we want you to realize that, again, as these populations change, there's all kinds of variations. So what's working on this? And what we need to do is give you a definition, gene pools and allele frequency. So we talked about genomes, and I just want to do a reminder on what that was. Again, a genome is all of the DNA in an individual. So a gene pool would be all the genetic material in a population. And then allele frequencies is how common is each of these alleles within the population. So for instance, when we were doing our genetic problems, we had large B, small b. How much of the alleles in the population are large Bs and how much in the population are small Bs. That is the allele frequencies. And what evolution is, population changes are changes in these allele frequencies. How many do we see? And then how is that expressed in the next generation in our population? So that's really what we're looking at. And so we're going to look at a method next on how to calculate that.